right. So welcome everybody. It is 4 o'clock on Wednesday, the 8th of June. I hope everybody's having a good week. We are going to get started today. I'm going to try to get through as much of the slideshow that I created as I can. And then we will take about a 10-minute break, and I'm going to turn it over to Decker, who's going to do his part of the lecturing. While we worked this out beautifully starting a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. While I am talking, Decker will man the chat. While Decker is talking, I will woman the chat. And we've gotten very good, of course, over the years of trying to do both a little bit. But we are going to try to keep the chat. You can throw anything in a chat if you have a question. You can always unmute and ask. We're very, very, very positive about that stuff. But we're going to talk a little bit about the history, which will set the stage, as we said. Thank you for everything. And then take a break and do the first of the art pieces. So I want to start a little bit today. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share sound, although I don't think I have too much going on for for sound today. But I want to talk a little bit about how we function as in academic. So as you may have heard me say, the packets themselves, which kind of look like this, are waiting for anybody who wants them in the main office. If you go into the main office, on the right corner, kind of against the windows, you don't even have to really talk to anybody. There's just 2 giant stacks of paper. If you're at summer school and other people on this call are not on summer school or going to summer school, or if you happen to swing by to grab something, and you can always just say, hey, get me a copy to somebody else. We're not checking them out. They're not anything else. I'll keep running by and checking and making sure we have enough. But don't feel like if you take one and your sibling also needs one, that's you can't take 2. You absolutely can. And please, please, please do. Yes, Nikki did point out the font changes every year. You do have access to these copies electronically. And as Decker and I had a really nice discussion this year, because it is, of course, an era in history, there are lots of maps. It often helps to have them color coded. We only have black and white printers at Stockdale, so I have put the color versions onto the slideshows. I will share both Decker and my slideshows as they go. They will grow over the time, because like this slideshow that I have is only up through the end of the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. But I think, yes, I did not, I went up through the 7 Years' War. Just kidding, the French and Indian War. But I will add to it, he will add to his, and we will make those slideshows available to you. But I do want to talk a little bit about how to study first. So I want you to think of something that you are totally into, something that you love. We played, when we did the introduction session on Monday, I played a little clip of Hamilton, and a whole bunch of people in chat were like, oh my gosh, I'm singing along with every word. Well, you didn't learn every word from the first second that you heard it. You listened to it maybe once, and you were sort of like, oh, I like that song. And then maybe you put it on repeat, or maybe you looked up the lyrics, or maybe you, as we talk about with Decker, you fell down a rabbit hole where you started looking into it, or you found a video clip of it, or whatever. And so you built your knowledge of those lyrics over time. And the same is true whether you're a sports aficionado or you're really into crocheting, or you love, whatever, math. It doesn't matter, whatever it is that you're fascinated by, you don't learn it all at once. And the same thing is true for academic times a million. The fancy education term for that is called scaffolding. Scaffolding is what you put on a building to help build it up. Kind of looks a little bit like the outline, like the Eiffel Tower. But you sort of make the bones of it, and then you hang pieces of the building as you go, right? You build the floors, you put in the walls and whatever. And the nuances are like you paint or you put furniture in or whatever it is. The same thing is going to be true with learning academic. So there's no one right way to learn it, just like there's no one right way for you to learn lyrics that you love or anything like that. But imagine that you are going to visit and revisit this material. You might be the kind of person who likes to listen to the lectures, whether that's live or you'll listen to the recordings as we go, and then read afterwards. You might be one of those people who reads first and then comes and listens to the lectures. You might physically want to highlight, underline, you might want to take notes. All of those are going to be things that help you build the broad strokes and then fill in the details as you go. For myself, I always read without a pen in my hand. I read through the section I think I'm going to lecture about, just to get the big idea. What does this topic cover? What does the packet writer focus on? What's important? What gets dropped in and lost later? And then I go back, and of course I make these slideshows, and Decker makes his slideshows. And we highlight a lot of information, some of which you'll catch now, some of which you'll have to go back and look at again as we go. So without further ado, it's 4:10. I'm going to lecture until about 4:45, 4:50, somewhere in there. I will try to, or sooner or later. Again, if you're just joining us, feel free to throw questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute. We are recording, so if you're shy, you can keep your cameras off. If you are not shy, you can keep your cameras on. Absolutely anything is fine. Like I said, feel free to ask as many questions as possible. Then we'll take a real break. You'll go, stand up, stretch, get water or whatever you need, go to the bathroom. And then we will have about another 45 minutes or so of one more lecture that'll be about art, and we'll talk about that in a little while. And that's how we're going to work pretty much all the practices, although as you heard me say, maybe on Monday, we're going to alternate. So some days it'll be SOSI first and then art, and other days it'll be art first and then the SOSI. That way, if you can be there from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., but not after that, it will be different. You'll hear an alternating thing and kind of be able to keep up with both of those things. Or, likewise the other thing. And again, all recorded and everything else. So without further ado, I'm going to start with section 1 of the SOSI packet, but not get through it. So we start with this idea of the introduction. There's actually a page called Introduction. Always worth reading because it tells you how the guide is organized. It tells you how the guide is organized. So first and foremost, this guide will be divided into 4 sections. Again, this is the SOSI packet, social science, which is a fancy word for history. You can see Decker has his in a binder. Mine is not in a binder yet, but it can be. But they are all hole punched and stapled. So for your viewing pleasure. The guide will be divided into 4 sections. We're starting with the revolutionary origins. We'll get through about a third of it today. That is basically what led to the American Revolution. That's the years essentially 1763 to 1776. The political factors, the economic factors, the social factors that made the 13 British colonies declare their independence from Great Britain. The second section of the SOSI packet is the war itself. That's going to be the battles in New England, the stalemate in the mid-Atlantic, and then the Civil War in the South, not the 1861 to 65 literal Civil War, but that it's going to set it up, right? All of history is interconnected. Section 3 is creating a new nation. It basically follows everything from the Articles of Confederation, basically like how did we set up our whole government, right? The Constitution will actually kind of dig into those because those were the founding documents of the United States. And it goes in depth through the first two presidencies and the election of 1800, which was new to me, although my master's degree is in American Studies, the first switching of political party power. And a peaceful transition, which we were at the time the only modern democracy, although of course France follows us in 1789. And then the fourth section is basically the social revolution, but this idea that, you know, we fought for independence, and by we, I mean white male landowners fought for independence. And yeah, kind of people of color and women and, you know, natives, and it didn't quite go as well as we wanted to do that. But that's going to be the arc of how we study it. The guide itself is about 80 pages of information, maybe 75 pages of information. And so we'll be able to go through it roughly in about a month. It is, you know, right now, early to mid-June. And so we will be finishing this, you know, kind of, I'm thinking, you know, right around the time that summer school would end is my target date roughly for doing this. All right, so without further ado, I have set up my slideshows with the same sort of headings as they have. So you'll have, like I said, you'll have actual access to the slideshows to scroll through at your own convenience, and not just as part of this video, but you know, as if you want it as a study guide. And so I have organized mine also with lots of memes. Sorry, that's sort of me. So Native and European societies in North America is literally the title of this of this section. And the packet points out, look, our culture, our society, our shared vision of American history, and by our, I mean people who live in America now and consider themselves Americans as citizens, we tend to think of it as the revolution as an inevitable, like, you know, the Pilgrims came over, they wanted social freedom, they wanted religious freedom, they wanted individual liberty, they wanted economic prosperity, money, and that just inevitably led to a revolution where they were the most independent and the most socially free and the most economically, you know, whatever, But actually, the packet points out that's not entirely true. And it starts by reminding us about the 7 Years' War. Ask me how much I knew about the 7 Years' War as of yesterday. Really little. And so honestly, this is an issue for a lot of people. So let's start with the peeps who were here when the Europeans got here. So you know as well as I do that there were a lot of Native Americans here. This is just a graphic that sort of shows, hey, there is everybody from the Inuit who live up in the Arctic, like by Alaska, to the Nez Perce, which means pierced nose, that lived over in the Northwest, the Seminoles, the Hopi natives who live by where Mr. Decker is right now. Mr. Decker is in Arizona. The Kwakiutl, who live up again more in the Pacific Northwest, not quite as, they're farther west. They're like all the way at the coast. You may have learned about them. Fourth grade, like Native, or third grade, when you study Native Americans in California, very different curriculum from my growing up in New York City, where we learned about the Manhattan Indians, right? That's a thing. And the Iroquois, who we're going to talk a lot about today, and stuff like that. So there's not any one Native American. In fact, there's not any like 10. There's probably 1,000 different Native American tribes, many languages, many social groupings, including clans and tribes and villages and chiefdoms, and even something called the Confederacy. We'll talk about that with respect to the Iroquois Confederacy, which would be an alliance of multiple different tribes under different chiefs. tons and tons of different religions, customs, traditions, foods, hunting, gathering, housing, absolutely everything. And they had problems. I know you know this, especially if you are coming out of sophomore year and have already had world history, or junior year and you've had some American history. But even if you're just coming out of freshman year and you haven't had history for a whole long time, because Kern County does it weird, I hope are familiar with this idea that there was a lot of different practices that were going on. Okay, so the first British settlements encountered the Algonquin people. So I stop for a second and take a look at this bottom map over here. The Algonquin territory is actually a color on this map. I would not have picked this color, but this light tan that is basically half of what is now the United States. I made a little box around the part of the United States that I have blown up in this map. So if you take a look at from like down right over here, this is Jersey. So this is like this area right in the corner here, all the way up through like the top of Hudson's Bay, which is like all the way up here. So I snipped out this part and made a map, which is right over here. And roughly, I don't know what that is, 80% of this area is in some kind of Algonquin people, all the way from Jamestown, Virginia, which is like down here at the bottom, all the way up to Plymouth, Massachusetts, which is like out here. They were not a united group, but they all spoke various dialects of the Algonquin language. They included, and this is the kind of information that you will scaffold and come back to later, the idea of the Powhatan tribe by Jamestown, which you may remember is one of the very earliest settlements a little bit farther south, the Pequots and the Narragansetts. If you've ever read or heard of Moby Dick, the Pequod is, I think, the boat that they sail on. And of course, spelling very fluid and flexible because not a language that the European colonizers spoke. And they all were kind of hunting and fishing. Why? Because North America has a huge amount of game, both in the water and on land. And they grew the things we eat at Thanksgiving, right? That's the whole Thanksgiving story. They grew corn and beans and squash, which, despite having studied them last year as a different part of when we studied academic last year, I don't remember them being called the Three Sisters or referred to as the Three Sisters. In fact, I have no recollection of anything being called the Three Sisters at the time, but this packet would like you to know that corn and beans and squash are the three sister crops, the Three Sisters. There were conflicts with the British and the Algonquin tribes. In fact, Powhatan organized a confederacy. The Powhatan tribe decided that they would gather together other Algonquin tribes and try to fight off this westward expansion. You know that the American refrain was "Go west and westward ho," and the natives who lived there were like, "Yo, not such a plan." Unfortunately, as we know, not all that successful, partly because of biology. They literally, thank you, Todd. They literally, the European colonizers were gross beasts that brought things like smallpox and measles with them, and syphilis, and gave it to lots of the natives. The Wampanoags, which also were part of the Algonquin tribes, they literally fought the British. They were led by a chief called Metacomet. And because the British were like, hey, Metacomet isn't a good word that we know, we're going to call you King Philip, which the packet misspells, by the way, and puts in 2 L's, but I just want to point that out. I have a little King Philip's War here. I'm going to play it just so you get a little idea of what went down here. I think we can all hear it. Let me know if you can't hear it.
After the 1637 war between the English colonists and the Pequot Indians, Massachusetts was peaceful for several decades. But in 1675, another deadly conflict took place, one the English would remember for generations as King Philip's War. King Philip was actually a name given by the English to the Indian chief of the Wampanoag tribe, neighbors of Plymouth Colony.
Tensions between the Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoags were starting to develop because Plymouth Colony was growing and expanding, and taking over more and more land and placing more and more demands on the Wampanoags. The real showdown came when the English basically insisted that the Wampanoags turn over all their weapons. The Wampanoags refused.
To gain strength, the Indian chief known as King Philip formed an alliance with other tribes in the region. In 1676, those tribes mounted a coordinated assault on 52 New England villages. The Indians killed nearly 1,000 Puritans that year.
It looked like Plymouth was going to completely lose the war before it had hardly even begun. So they pulled in their neighbors, Connecticut and Massachusetts, to join in the attack on the Wampanoags, making it a much more full-scale war.
The white colonists of New England also joined forces with the Mohawk tribe, part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and together they fought the Wampanoags. In turn, the Wampanoags united with the Narragansett Indians.
The English, who at this point were inclined to see all Native Americans as enemies, attacked the other major group in the region, the Narragansetts. The end result was that the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts were pretty much hunted down.
The English and their Iroquois allies slaughtered every hostile Indian they could and sold the rest into slavery. In 1676, King Philip, the Wampanoag chief, was captured and drawn and quartered. Puritans carried his head on a spike back to Plymouth, where they displayed it for years as a grisly message to local tribes. The war nearly eliminated New England's Indian population.
Even though the English had suffered very much, this now ensured their control over the land and allowed them to expand and take over more territory without having to treat the Indians as allies and equals anymore. It remains the most destructive war that New England has ever experienced.
Okay, so again, there is conflict. This is going to happen. It happens in like every world war we participate in just about everything. But basically, King Philip, who is this Wampanoag chief, is like, wow, you're terrible people. We should probably fight you. And they at first they get the advantage, and then not. All right, so that's the Algonquin people. That's that whole tan section. That's basically everybody. And now I'm going to move it. Nope, stop talking there. I'm going to move it over to this reddish area, the Iroquois territory, which you may not recognize so much. These are the 5 Great Lakes over here. And this is sort of, the not quite, this is Maine is over here on the side and stuff. So this is kind of central New York. This is very easy for me to scaffold in my head, in large part because, do you see where this capital M is in the word Mohawk for Mohawk River? So right there, there's a city called Utica, and right near there is where I went to college. So these words, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, these are, excuse me, place names that are very, very, very familiar to me because I went to 4 years of college up there on the Mohawk River. This is extra confusing, by the way, for people from Stockdale, because this word Oneida is pronounced Oneida, but we had an attendance clerk for the last 5 years who spelled her name like this, but because she was of German ancestry, pronounced it Anita. So if you went to the attendance office and got a leave slip from Anita, she was actually Oneida Rodenberg. Okay, so we talked about the Algonquins, which sort of occupied almost all the rest of this. And then there was this other confederacy, meaning an alliance. The word confederacy means an alliance. The Europeans called them the Five Nations because there were the Oneida natives, the Onondaga natives, the Cayuga natives, the Seneca natives, and the Mohawk natives. So there are 5 tribes that all share the same language, similar language. And it started in the late 15th century. So 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, doesn't land there, but right around the same time, the Iroquois tribes start interacting with each other. By 1722, they got one more group of people, one more tribe. You can see it's this little circle at the bottom, the Tuscarora people, and it became actually the 6 nations and not the 5 nations. Basically, if you remember the map from before, I'm going to switch back 1 second to the map before. You can see that the Iroquois, this red area, it's inland, right? It's inland. The Algonquins are the ones that interact immediately with Plymouth Rock, with the Massachusetts colony, with, you know, all of the like, hi, we're European, nice to meet you, here's our ship. The 5 nations, or then 6 nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, are like, yo, let's just wait and see what happens. And not surprisingly, the Europeans really don't do a great job of like being friendly and kind and nice to everybody. So the Iroquois people are like, kind of not really your friend. Plus, if you'll notice, they occupy this sort of central area. Well, it turns out that they can kind of play the different European powers off of each other, right? They interact with the French. We'll see a map in a second. The French are down at the bottom. They interact with the Dutch. They interact with the English, who are up high, like in the Hudson Bay in Canada, what's now Canada. And even with the English, who are all along the coast, right? And they controlled the waterways. You know, she who controls the waterways controls the world, we learned last time. I actually put this up here. These are canals that exist now. They did not all exist back then, but you can see that literally you can sail up the Hudson River from, this is New York City, right down here. You can sail all the way up the Hudson River. You can get to the Hudson Bay, which is like in Canada here, or you can kind of hook a left and you can go down the Mohawk River. And by now, and this is modernized, but you can literally get, and back then you couldn't take your canoe all the way across, but you could portage your canoe and like, you know, hold it over your head and, you know, go some places overland and get to the Great Lakes and connect to the middle of the United States. Well, it's not the United States back then. So, and then I have to sing 15 miles on the Erie Canal. So she's singing about a donkey that pulls things on the Erie Canal. Basically, the quote from the packet, I like to throw quotes in from the packet every once in a while. It said, contact with the Europeans brought many changes to Native Americans. However, colonization should not be viewed as replacing established cultures with a new and better way of life. I don't know anybody who joins Acadec who is like, rah, you know, Merca Eagles, you know, get rid of those natives. But, you know, it needs to be said that, of course, colonizing doesn't mean bettering, you know, like anything like that. And this is, I love this. This is like, of course, the Southern Confederacy picture. And then this purple thing with the boxes and the tree in the middle, that is the symbol of the Iroquois Confederacy. And I feel very strongly like it should go on a shirt or something that we have. Okay, moving on. So let's talk about the British and the French colonization. So you can see this map. Great Britain is the yellow, and they sort of are the original 13 colonies, just about. There's on the coastline from Maine through Massachusetts down to, this is Georgia, which if you have ever watched a presidential election, you know where all of these things are. New France, which is the not really exciting name that France gave their colonies, goes basically the inland part, like, you know, on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, which are right over here, all the way from Newfoundland, which is up here in Canada, like cold as anything, across the Great Lakes, across the whole Ohio, the whole Ohio River Valley, down the Mississippi River, this is Louisiana down here, all the way west to the Rocky Mountains. This is gonna get sold in 1804 as the new Louisiana Purchase here, but honestly, like France owned a bajillion people. I mean, a bajillion acres, like a gazillion. I don't even have a word for that. You know that this is French, maybe because if you've ever heard people speaking French or Creole in Louisiana, you may know this. This, of course, is owned by Spain, Florida, parts of the Caribbean, and what is later becomes Mexico and the Southern California thing. But here's the trick. France had much, much, much more land, but ain't got no people in it. At the beginning, by the time we got to the 7 Years' War, which will be in a little while, the British population in these yellow bits was 2 million people. And the French population in all this whole green area was only 65,000 people. That's fewer people than live in the city of Bakersfield and spread out over a ton of places. So that is the setup for where things are going. And so this is one of those maps that I said I would show you in color. This is actually in your packet. Do I think you need to know where all these things are? It's definitely worth looking at later, once the scaffold is all in place. Once the scaffold is all in place. I did not know that about you, Mr. Decker. Okay, so France in this map is blue, and you can look at all these names: Fort Dauphin, Fort Lorraine, Fort, I can't even say half of these things. Fort Toulouse-Lautrec. Great Britain, of course, owns essentially what becomes the 13 colonies, and they all have names that are familiar to us and English versions of names. And they gave France gave Great Britain some of these weird purple colonies up here way back before, and here's Spain, over here and over there. So this is a map of North America as it was divided up. You'll notice that there are no spaces on here for tribes because, nobody was counting the Native Americans that were already here. France's territory is blue, Great Britain's is in pink, and then also purple, and Spain's is orange. So here we go, yo. All right. So at first, everybody has a pretty nice relationship. Everybody's trading goods like woven cloth and metal kettles and iron axes and fish hooks, which is spelled in the packet without a hyphen, and so it looks like fish hooks, and guns, right? And those trades transformed everything. Think about how much differently you would cook if you had a metal kettle that could go right on a fire instead of on a terracotta pot. Think about what you could do with an iron axe in terms of agriculture, tree chopping, what you build your houses out of if you had access to, honed iron. Think about your hunting practices if you had fish hooks or arrowheads or whatever. Think about your warring practices with other tribes if you have access to guns. Needless to say, the Europeans did not give these away for free, and so they traded for things like furs. And so the number of furs that they could demand for, let's say, guns went up exponentially, and now you're over hunting, over fishing, and really inciting conflict among the tribes that are trying to hunt or fish or whatever in the same space as before. And of course, that's the fur traders, trying to get the Native Americans to fight each other. That's the idea. All right, why were things so different? So let's take a look at how the French interacted with the natives who lived in North America before the colonists. And then the next slide, we'll look at how the British interacted with them. So starting with the French. France was and continues to be mostly Catholic. They thought of the natives as savages who, this is a quote from someone that we'll talk about, Father Paul Lejeune. As to the mind of the savage, he said, it is of good quality. I believe that souls are made from the same stock and that they do not materially differ. In other words, we need to save these poor savages who don't know all about Catholicism. We need to convert them to our religion so that their souls will go to heaven and not to hell. He thought that Indians, let's lump them all together just like he did. He thought that they, and remember we just said there's no they, but he thought that they were strong and intelligent and content and diplomatic. But he also thought that they were arrogant and prideful and vindictive and lacked compassion. Okay, so that was, he actually, he was a Jesuit priest. He spent 17 years in the colony of New France, that inner area of North America. And he published a magazine called Jesuit Relations. It published, oh, it says 1932. It should be 1732. Hold that thought while I quickly change that. Hold on. Nope, escape. It should be 1732 to 1773. There you go. And he basically, that's wild, Todd. He basically published, he was the initial author and the initial editor. He didn't stay on there for, 41 years, but where it went out to all of France and it tried to give instructions. It's 1632 to 1670. Just kidding. All right. Just kidding, I say. Hold that thought while I change that to 16. Apparently I can't type at all. All right. Just kidding. It's good I didn't post this yet. Okay, so he basically writes a how-to manual for how to convert the native peoples to be Catholic. Those of you who grew up in California, the same thing was happening out here with the missions, right? The Spanish missions. And he also was like, hey, French people, come live in the new world. It's so cool here. So that's what his thing was. Part of his enticement was that the French traded constantly. They had very long-term relationships in terms of trading partners with various tribes, and intermarriage was common. If I'm remembering correctly, one of the people in the Lewis and Clark group that it went to explore the Louisiana Purchase and look for a passage out to the Pacific Ocean that was overland in the North America was a French trader guy who brought his native wife with him. So that's the French there. The British were like, nah, fam, you do you, we're gonna do us. They tried to remain very separate from the native tribes. They wanted to displace, my dog is here. They wanted to essentially kick the natives off of their land and settle it for them. They thought it was okay to trade, but they really frowned on intermarriage. The British, by the way, are almost entirely Protestant. That remains true to this day. In fact, one of the biggest conflicts is with Ireland, which tends to be almost entirely Catholic. Not entirely, but almost entirely Catholic. In fact, if you remember any of your European history, literally the King Henry VIII wanted to get divorced and the Catholic Church was like, no. And so he was like, new religion time, mic drop. There you go. And so the British had this theory that because Native Americans did not build on and improve, let me put improve in little air quotes, improve. Oh, it says my internet connection is unstable. Did you lose me for a second? Are we okay? Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
The
okay.
British felt that, what, Mom?
Just said you're okay. We can
Good,
hear you.
excellent. So the British felt that because the Native Americans didn't build permanent structures, for instance, on the land, or till it the way that a British farmer would, or build streets and roads and, all kinds of other institutions, that they didn't really deserve the land and had no claim to it. And so it was like free for the taking because, they were like traveling peoples and, whatever. And so basically the British interaction with the Algonquin tribes, that are a lot of other tribes, basically followed this pattern. They would clash with the native tribes. The British would clash with the native tribes, or the colonists would clash with the native tribes. They would defeat them because they had military superiority, mostly because of guns. They would then negotiate a treaty, but as we all know, it's very hard to negotiate a good, solid treaty when you're the defeated party. And then they'd kind of be like, oh yeah, colonists don't really, you should, just feeling like you shouldn't live there. Oh, you're already living there. What can we do? So they just kind of let it, do whatever. Okay. But of course, England and France had been fighting for, let's go with, I don't know, 1,500 years at least. It is weird for us to hear that a little bit, because in our lifetimes, and I mean that, pretty universally, France was, as we know, kind of on the wrong side in World War II, but that was partly because they got taken over by Nazis. For me, my whole life, so 50 years, England and France have been friends. Like, there has not been conflict. The worst conflict we've had is Brexit, right? It's not really a conflict. But if you go back till, I don't know, the year 1000 and beyond, literally every 5.5 minutes, England and France are at war. So what are you gonna say?
Your connection is glitchy.
A little unstable.
Yes.
Okay, so let me say that again. We have lived in an era of France and England being friends for really my entire life. France and England have been allies without question, but that's not been true. And that was not true back in the 1700s, for sure. So in fact, before they fought in the 7 Years' War, which was really actually 9 years, there were 3 wars that were still between England and France before we got to the war that we called the 7-Year War that was important. So what happens there? Well, fur traders in Pennsylvania and Virginia, which are sort of middle central. I know none of you guys know your East Coast geography. So Pennsylvania is a big kind of rectangular state, and Virginia is kind of a weird shape because West Virginia sits on it. They're kind of in the middle. And they wanted to trade in the Ohio River Valley, which is actually weirdly comes farther south than you would think it was. Lake Erie is kind of at the northern border between us and Canada, but the Ohio River is comes all the way down through Pennsylvania and Virginia down here. And so the fur traders, the colonists, that were not quite Americans because we don't have an America as a country yet, but they want to trade in this area, this Ohio River Valley, which is filled with lots of, good animals to hunt and things like that. And so in 1749, they all gather together, these Virginian people kind of all gather together, and they form something they call the Ohio Company. Now, of course, if you know your British history, you know that that's not weird, right? The British East India Trading Company, the Dutch East India Trading Company, right? There are whole 100 centuries in history, hundreds of years in history where, actual private companies end up owning land and, doing these kinds of governance things. So they got together and they secured 200,000 acres. So an acre is about the size of a football field. So they got together and secured, do you see this green area? What is now all of West Virginia and more. France was like, yo, what the act? So they built all these blue forts that you see along the Allegheny River here. And then Britain built all these red forts in here, and they start fighting, fight, right? And the Native Americans get involved because really territory, and there are all these people warring on it. And so they're picking sides as well. And that is going to lead to, of course, eventually the formation of the United States of America, but not yet. So this map is in 1748, they get 200,000 acres. And by 1752, they get another 300,000 acres. What the heck, dude? That's a lot of places. All right, so tensions erupt. And the British are getting kind of worried because there's a lot of tension with the French, and of course everybody has native allies because the Native Americans ally themselves with either the French or the British, And so all of these different colonies are like, nail biting. What should we do? What should we do? So the bunch of them, it's 4:45. I'm going to go just a little farther and then I'll stop. All the, there are 13 British colonies. We know this because eventually there will be, a rebellion of 13 British colonies. 7 of them get together and they each send delegates. Small colonies send fewer people, bigger colonies send more people. Somewhere each colony that attends sends between 2 and 7 people to this conference. And they call it a Congress, and they meet in Albany, New York. It's very important to me that you learn how to pronounce it as Albany. I know when you see it written, a lot of you guys, I've heard it said a million times, Albany. It's pronounced Albany. You have to pronounce it like a good New Yorker. Albany, New York. The 7 colonies, this is one of those scaffolding moments that you should come back to later when you get it. Connecticut sends people, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. If you know the geography of the 13 colonies, it's basically like the northern groups, which are the ones that are mostly dealing with this stuff. Remember, we're in like the Ohio Valley. So like Georgia doesn't send people, right? All the down people don't send, but and their question is like, what do we do about France? And what do we do about the Native Americans? And so they try to negotiate a treaty with the Iroquois Confederacy. Remember that red swath in that picture, that central area? Those are the people directly affected. And they also kind of gathered together to discuss what was happening with France and this French-owned territories that are to the north, like French Canada. They were too conscious of their own independence, right? Each of the colonies has their own rules, their own rulers, their own governance structure, and everything else. And so they're not ready to form a new nation together, a new alliance. But this is going to set the stage for the rebellion that we fight eventually in 1776. So again, this is 1754. We're like 20 years out, roughly, from when the 13 colonies unite together and rebel against the British, monarchy. But it's kind of sowing the seeds. And they spent a lot of time talking about Benjamin Franklin. Yeah, that same Benjamin Franklin had a plan, which got called the Albany Plan, which, because it was in Albany, which is now, by the way, the capital of New York State. So there you go. Let's talk about Ben Franklin's Albany Plan, and in a few minutes, we'll take our break. So he looked at which thankfully, Nikki, it's great that they have such not creative names, because that helps us remember them. Okay, so Ben Franklin is like, I see how the Iroquois Confederacy all gets together, these 6 different tribes, and they all agree to fight together for the greater good of the whole people. So Ben Franklin was like, okay, what if we had kind of a unified government where each colony would have those 2 to 7, I may have mixed up the 2 to 7 delegates. I think the Albany Congress just has everybody show up. And Ben Franklin's plan, I take it back, is 2 to 7 delegates per colony. So kind of like our House of Representatives now, where small states have only a couple of representatives, and more populous states like California have a lot more representatives. So, hey, Ben Franklin, getting it right, whatever. He was like, and we'll have a president that kind of oversees everything. But in his version, because they are still British colonies, the monarch, whoever is in charge of England, will appoint that president. And the colonies were like, no, I don't think so, but whatever. But it's going to get an early attempt to unite under one government as far as might be necessary for defense and other general important purposes. So that's Ben Franklin's proposal of this. This is an early picture, by the way, on the left-hand side. This is an early picture of George Washington. And I will say, yeah, exactly. Oh my God, 1000%. I will say, I have a little bit more time. Good. I'm gonna tell the story because this is a fantastic story. I don't know how old all of you guys are, but let's go with an average age of 15 or 16, right? So you guys know a lot of 21-year-olds, and you know that they're not always like the most, they tend to be a little bit more hot-headed. They tend to be a little bit like less cautious. Like they're not the elder statesmen of the group, right? They're the ones who are like, you know, ready, fire, aim, right? You know, hold my beer. Okay, so back on the frontier, the Virginia governor, whose name is Robert Dinwiddie, in 1753, he sends this 21-year-old kid who looks like this. See this kid who's like 21 and not even able to grow a beard? He sends his 21-year-old kid whose name is George Washington. You might want to remember that, folks. That'll come up as important later. And he sends him off to the French forts and is like, hey, French fort people, you need to leave. You need to leave. And he was only a major in the colonial army at the time. He was in the, actually not, there's not an army per se, because we don't have a nation. So he's in the militia, that whole Second Amendment, like, you know, a well-organized militia, not an individual, but a well-organized militia. Okay. So he goes to the French forts and he's like, my daddy says you got to leave. And the French people are like, no. And so he goes home for like a year, and then he goes back a year later with a couple of friends. He brings his buddies. He sees a French scouting party on the Pennsylvania border and he attacks them. May 27, 1754. He is now, 22? He attacks. 10 French guys are killed and they take 21 people prisoner. And the French are like, oh no, au contraire, mon frère. They defeated Washington and disarmed him and all his men at a wonderful place called Fort Necessity, a British fort. And instead of like being like, okay, that was really dumb and caused by a 22-year-old dude who, like, you know, whatever, England hears it and declares war on France. England hears it and declares war on France. And how much time do I have? Okay, there's a bunch more. So we will start when I come back, we will start with World War Zero. World War Zero is the 7 years war, the last 9 years, is the 7 years war that literally occurs everywhere, some of it even in North America, but is mostly everywhere else. And this is going to, it, as the packet says, the 7 years war is the setup for our own revolution, you know, a little while later. So let me stop my share and pause my recording. All right, so we have resumed recording right now. It does say recording in the corner. Mr. Decker, I believe you have the option to share screen.
Oh, goody.
And I don't know if everybody has the option to like change their names or anything, but you know, feel free to put your name as you like it on there. Mr. Decker is going to, he has shared this slideshow with me, that art slideshow, and I will make sure that it is all available to you. But without further ado, Mr. Decker has been coaching for such an amazing time, and he and I are just the perfect companion. So one more time, I will say, if you have any questions and you would throw them into chat, I will be womaning the chat, and otherwise I will go on from there. So excellent. Thank you, Mr. Decker. Take it away.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
perfectly.
Just want to make sure.
The table of contents.
Yes, yes. So this is the art packet. And the first section, which I'm not going to start on today, it's pretty much the same every single year that I've been doing. Well, not entirely. Maybe the last 25 years it's been the same. Longer than you've all been alive, except for certain people. And I will cover this later. I might record it and simply send it over rather than spending, although I don't know, I go back and forth. I've done this lecture so many times on section 1. I should probably have it recorded for posterity at some point. But basically, section 1, which is the longest section in the art packet, it's almost 50 pages long. It covers introduction to art history, a brief overview of art in the Western world. And by Western world, they start with cave paintings in Lascaux, France, and Altamira, Spain. As we're starting 32,000 BC cave paintings, and they go all the way through. If you took art history 101 in college, this is what they would cover. And I know this because back in the 90s, when I'd lecture this to my kids, they didn't believe me. And then they'd come back and they literally had taken art history 101 in college, and they bring back the syllabus and they're laughing because they spent 18 weeks covering what I basically cover in lectures over section 1 of the art packet. And I used to cover it in like 3 days, and they spent 18 weeks covering it. And they said just from our 3 days of covering it, they were able to get easy A's. So I don't know. That was 20 years ago. Maybe it's not still true. But so I would like to actually do this fast preview of art history at some point. They go through all the old ancient civilizations from, again, the old cave paintings, the Middle Stone Age, New Stone Age, Mesopotamian art, Persian art, ancient Egyptian art, Nubian art. They go through all the art of the Mediterranean, early Roman, meaning Etruscan art, and it's quite intense. It's quite intense. Byzantine, and then they go into the isms. They go to Baroque art, and then Rococo, Neoclassicism, Romanticism, Impressionism, Realism, and they go through all the isms. Modernism, minimalism, photorealism. Anyway, it's quite interesting. And then they added a section about 20, 25 years ago on non-Western art, which included Asian art, African, Oceanic art, Islamic art, the Americas. Guys, I highly recommend you read through this because you get an immense sense of art throughout the ages and all these different cultures, and art as propaganda, which we're going to get heavily into in this packet this year, and art as a power statement. You know, the pyramids are a giant power statement. Look at what I can build, right? Pharaoh takes 20,000 guys and takes 20 years to build something. That's power, you know. Or we're going to build fountains in the middle of a desert, Mesopotamia. This is art as power statement. It's very interesting. Anyway, besides historical art, which is sort of contextual basis for looking at art, we get into the actual elements and processes and techniques of art. By elements of art, this is pretty standard. We have line, shape, form, perspective, color, texture, and composition. They used to call it the 7 elements of art, that I've noticed they've now stuck shape and form together. So technically, maybe there's only 6. Hey, it's the 6 tribes of, never mind. All right, so nations, whatever. And then we get into processes and techniques: drawing, printmaking, painting, photography, sculpture, mixed media, performance, craft and evoke art, and architecture. And they sum it all up on page 47. So we're going to come back to this later, and I'm going to try to refer to different things in section 1 as I'm lecturing on the different piece of art. Like, for instance, one of our first, actually not our first artwork, but later on, we're going to talk about an artwork created by Paul Revere, who's the subject of the first artwork today. And we're going to talk about what's an engraving and what's an etching. And we'll get into that. Well, they cover etching and engraving as part of a process and technique of doing art. Can't remember which page it's on, but it's in there. I think 39, 40, somewhere in there. And so we'll keep coming back to different parts of this. And of course, it all permeates and overlaps and things like that. But we'll get the idea. The overall structure of what we're going to be covering as it relates to the theme this year is in 4 more sections. We have section 2, which I'm going to start on in a few minutes, which covers colonial portraiture. And that starts on page 49 and ends up on page 63. So you notice this is only 14, 15 pages long, as opposed to the previous section, which is almost 50 pages long. There'll be 5 different specific selected works in the colonial portraiture section to section. And that means every one of these works you have to know in depth. And by in depth, we have to be able to analyze how the works were created, who the works were created by, the historical context that they are created in, the subject matter. It's the whole ball of wax here. And of course, since none of this is done in a vacuum, there will be other works of art that relate to the specific works of art. So a lot of students in the past would say, well, why are you, Mr. Decker, going over this piece of artwork? That's not even one of the selected pieces of art. Yes, but it greatly influenced one of our selected pieces, or they refer to it multiple times in the packet, or. So we'll be getting through a lot of different artwork in the next month. Section 3, early history painting, and there's 5 works again in that section. And there's a lot of overlap. This is not chronological. In section 4, we have neoclassical art and architecture and the rise of what they refer to as the neoclassicism movement in the United States. And again, if you go back to section 1, neoclassicism right in between Rococo and Romanticism. So really to understand neoclassicism better, you have to go back and look at how it relates, because a lot of times in art and music and history, movements happen as reactions to previous movements. So it's like when disco was big in the 70s, it's like, no, right? And this is why I have no hair, because I tore it all out. And so we had to have a reaction to disco. And so you get an idea. So to understand neoclassicism, you have to understand the things that came before it, and then so on and so forth. And we get into, here's where we get into some of the architectural works, Monticello by Thomas Jefferson, and different statues, Horatio Greenborough, the George Washington statue, the Forever Free by Mona Lewis. So that's in the section 4. And then finally, section 5, nature and nation, which really, if it wasn't chronological before, now it's really not chronological. And actually it is semi-chronological, except you'll see 1796 before 1770, and then 1840. And then in section 5, we'll talk about nature and we'll talk about early America. And we mean early America, way before the colonists. We'll talk about Chaco Canyon from that was built over a series of about 3 centuries. And we'll talk about what they say about that there. We'll revisit Charles Wilson Peale, who unearthed a mastodon and created a museum in Philadelphia. And we studied all about him last year, and a view of Kentucky. And then we finally end up on a totem pole from the Sitka National Historic Park. That's the overview. And of course, there's glossary. And one of the things they always mention is every time you see a black highlighted word in the packet, there's a glossary at the back of the packet that gives their definition of that word. So that's a brief overview. And as you see, all these different, starting with the cave paintings and going to the great ziggurat of Ur in Mesopotamia, and stone stela, and Tutankhamun's funeral mask, and different types of columns, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and Contrapposto, which is just a guy curving his body in an S shape and his elbow sticking out. We got the Colosseum and Byzantine art. Byzantine was just East Rome before Rome fell. And we get the Duomo in Florence and all sorts of wonderful stuff. Hey, notice there's no pie on her face here, for those of you that have been paying attention to current events. And this painting, oh, so many different things to cover. As you can see, I like covering all this. I find it fascinating. Look at all that. 50 pages of, and here we are, colonial portraiture section 2. And I can actually go to the nifty PowerPoint that I've created. What the heck? we're just going to cover the first part of section 2, which starts on page 49, and we're going to cover the first work of art specifically to this section. But there's a little preview stuff first, and that first work of art is by John Singleton Copley, and he did a painting of Paul Revere in 1768. So the section here on page 49 in section 2 starts with the history of early American portraiture. And they mention Puritans settled New England early to mid 17th century. They're going for religious freedom. And yeah, that's in the history. So how does that affect the art? Well, portraiture was their way to establish identity and family lineages. You've left your old country, you've left your home. How do they keep their family alive? We can't take photos, we can't do selfies, right? And how do we make us? I'm speaking of them as us. There you go. So they really were leaving the old world because they wanted to be able to do things their own way. And one of the things they wanted to do their own way was wanted to worship their own way. And they really were against excess and idolatry. And so they didn't like big, huge, fancy Gothic cathedrals with the stained glass windows and all the statues and the fancy stuff. They really just wanted plain simple. So in your packet, this is the interior of a Puritan church built in Hingham, Massachusetts in 1681. Puritan churches were unadorned and plain, and the Puritans rejected religious painting in their places of worship as they associated it with excess and idolatry. They disavowed ostentatious displays of prosperity, and this is based in their idea of the Calvinist doctrine of prosperity. Calvinism, per se, was the belief that everything is predestined, and when you're born, you're already predestined for your outcome. Well, Puritans didn't take it that far. They basically said, though, that the Calvinist idea of hard work, and that hard work and being religiously faithful, that would lead to ultimate prosperity. That's what they're into. God will reward the hardworking religious faithful. They also favored what's known as the Elizabethan style of portraiture, specifically not the grand manner style, which would in the future dominate the style of portraiture in Europe in the 18th century, which was inspired by Anthony van Dyck. They don't get into all that. I was going to get into all that, go down that rabbit hole, but as far as I can tell, they don't test you on that, but I haven't read through the whole packet, so I'll come back to that. So what was the Elizabethan style? If not grand manner style, what's Elizabethan? Well, it's called linear. And again, if you go back to section 1 at the elements of art, page 35, you'll talk about the elements of art: line, shape, form, well, line, linear, really focused on line as an element. And in this particular style with portraits, focused on costume details. They say they don't believe in ostentatious displays of prosperity. That being said, if we paint a portrait of somebody who's been really successful due to their hard work, that's okay. So there's a little bit of hypocriticalness coming in. Anyway, the first vocabulary word that pops into the literature here, when they mention pendant portraits. And pendant portraits are portraits that are done in pairs. Yeah? And I never really knew that before. Pendant portraits, portraits that come in pairs. So we're going to look at a pair of pendant portraits. Ooh, alliteration. And they're by an unknown itinerant limner. An itinerant, right? Somebody who goes from town to town. And a limner is somebody who would paint not only portraits, but signage, on sale today only, formal portrait. They did all sorts of things. And so we don't really know who painted these. And these pendant portraits they're talking about here on the next slide demonstrate the religious devotion and wealth of the sitters in the pendants, as well as involvement in global trade and rising consumerism of the 17th century. So all of this is going to be told in these two pendant portraits. So there they are. there's the two portraits. The first one of John Freak, painted around 1671, and then his wife and child, Elizabeth Freak and baby Mary, about 3 years later.
Decker, can I interrupt you for one quick second?
Absolutely.
In the chat, there was a question, can pendant portraits be made with any media, or does it depend on the medium type?
Good question. As far as I can tell, my dog is barking. As far as I can tell, I would think it could be any medium, but I will research that and answer that on Monday, because I really had never, I'd never really heard. All it says is, in art, 2 paintings intended to be displayed as a pair. So pendant portraits, I would think, would have to be paintings, but I'll make sure that that word is not used in other styles. I will research that, because a lot of times the book does not give the complete definition. Good question. So John Freak here, they don't put the paintings in your packet, and this is why a lot of times you have to go through the electronic versions as well as the hard copy versions. I've tried pushing my finger on the links on the hard copies. They absolutely don't work. You have to use the electronic links. And they have underlined John Freak and Elizabeth Freak and baby Mary. Those are the links, and it goes to these paintings. Otherwise, they don't have them in the book. And what they do have is the description. So for those of you who are doing Decathlon for the first time, what are the test questions going to be like? Well, they're not going to test you on these paintings per se. However, you can have test questions based on the details about the paintings. And to me, it's easier to remember the details if you can see the works themselves. So they mentioned that John Freak was a wealthy Boston merchant and lawyer, and he's wearing a dark brown velvet coat decorated with 22 shiny silver buttons, intricate lace collar, elaborate cuffs and gloves. Dark neutral background focuses attention on the details of dress and accessories. He's looking rather foofy. All right, he's wearing a foofy shirt. And I've got links in here to the packets, and if you click on those, it'll take you to a larger scale version. You can see more of the detail, and you can see the 22 buttons, and you can see the gloves and the frill, and the, yeah, it's, there you go, the nice curly hair. So Elizabeth Freak and baby Mary, she's wearing a pearl necklace and a garnet bracelet and a gold ring. The pearls likely imported from China, the garnets imported from India, and the clothing was adorned with ribbons and delicate lace, and the lace was imported from Europe. Remember in the previous slide, we mentioned that this demonstrates, these pendant portraits demonstrated religious devotion and the wealth of the sitters, as well as involvement in global trade and rising consumerism. It's 1674, and they're importing stuff from China, India, and Europe, and then somebody's painting a picture of these items, which, you know, really fascinating from a consumerism standpoint. Now, you'll notice that these paintings, they're done way better than I could do, but to me, and I think it's accentuated in the text of the packet, the details of the dress and everything is more intricate and more telling than the actual facial features. To me, the woman and the child don't really look quite real. They're very stiff, stilted. Imagine they'd have to sit for hours, you know, for the painter to do it right. And we don't know who this painter is. These are itinerant painters. They're not attributed to anybody. Typical of portraits at the time, the 1600s. But this is this Elizabethan style, and line is the focus, three-dimensionality, shadowing in order to show three-dimensionality, chiaroscuro, which is a concept that we'll talk later on with balancing light and dark. This looks rather flat is the word that we would use to describe these works. So, and this is going to become important when we look at some of the later changes in portraiture. The next work that it mentions, again, not one of the specific works we're going to be studying, next work from the same period, around 1680. This is a self-portrait by one Thomas Smith. Thomas Smith was not an artist. He was probably a merchant. He was perhaps a captain. This is hinted at in the background where there's some Dutch and English ships. They call it a window view of a seascape. He wears fine ruffled lace, indicating wealth. He's also got his hand on a skull. And by the way, again, if you go to this link, you'll get a bigger, more resolute view of this. And he's got a hand on a skull. And this is called a memento mori, which is Latin. And it literally means remember that you will die. Well, isn't that a warm, cuddly thing? Its inclusion here suggests that earthly wealth and accomplishments are meaningless in the face of the afterlife. He's even got a little 8-line sonnet underneath that they don't even mention in the packet. But it's all to indicate that, you know, all this, it's transitory. Life is transitory. This has got a little bit more three-dimensionality to it. You can see it's starting to get some shading, trying to show some depth in the work. So it's a little bit more advanced than the earlier itinerant works of the pendants. And this was not really a formally trained artist. This is the earliest known American self-portrait and the only known 17th century New England portrait by an identified artist, Thomas Smith. Pretty cool. I mean, everything else, it's like, well, we don't know who made this. We know who made this. Reflects a shift in American art from the highly decorative yet superficial Elizabethan style to the more three-dimensional Baroque style. And again, you can go back in the packet and learn about the Baroque era and the Neoclassical era, so on and so forth. Notice his eyes. I find that a little unnerving. The eyes look a little goofy to me, but again, he's self-taught, did way better than I could have done. Speaking of self-taught, well, sorry, one more slide, forgot. Hold that thought, that self-taught thought. They also mention on page 50, one John Smibert. Born in Scotland, studied art in London. He was the first academically trained artist to live and work in the colonies. So we got a lot of firsts here. First earliest American self-portrait, only known 17th century New England portrait, you know, and then first academically trained artist to live and work in the colonies. Introduced modeling and naturalism to the colonies. And this is a work of art called the Bermuda Group, Dean Berkeley and his entourage. This is Dean Berkeley's patron. This is Dean Berkeley. He basically is going to start a school for the arts in the colonies. He's got 2 other investors. He's got his wife, I think sister and daughter. And then this is John Smibert over here on the left. He's the only one looking directly at, actually, she's looking directly at us. Well, the baby's looking, there's 3 of them looking directly at us. So, but this is John Smibert over here. That's sort of a self-portrait within. And it's a complex arrangement of figures in different poses. So this is much more advanced than this work, which was more advanced than the pendant works. So just kind of showing you some stuff here. And John Smibert, this is a whole, this endeavor, the Bermuda Group, you can actually go to this link. This will not be tested. They don't bring it up, but I like going down these rabbit holes. And so this Bermuda Group commemorated an ambitious venture to found a seminary in Bermuda. And this guy Berkeley, he was frustrated with the corrupt European civilization and got all these financiers and trying to set up the seminary in the New World. And it didn't work. They lost a lot of money. And the only one to wind up going to the New World and staying there was Smibert. Oops, Smibert. So he winds up staying. And what becomes very interesting is he winds up bringing these new techniques, not new techniques, but European techniques to the colonies, to the New World. And so he's like the guy in the New World to be looking at how he does art, which becomes really, really important to one John Singleton Copley. Remember, I talked about that previous guy, the merchant, not Smibert, but Thomas Smith, being self-taught. Well, this is the king of self-taught people. Copley, fascinating individual. He's born in Boston in 1738. His father died when he was only, I think it was 8 or 10 years old. Let's see. Yeah, I think he was 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old. A few years later, his mother remarries one Peter Pelham. So by the time she remarried Copley, John is 10 years old. His stepfather, Peter, was an engraver and a portraitist. And John just picked up a whole lot of art in a short period of time. Pelham dies 3 years later. So Copley's only 13 years old, and he takes over his stepfather's art studio. So imagine being 13 years old and taking over your stepfather's art studio. He teaches himself how to paint using his stepfather's anatomy books, and he becomes so successful that when Smibert wants to sell his studio and retire, Copley buys Smibert's studio. That's amazing. This is a kid. He's barely a teenager, and he is becoming highly successful. Copley is known for his lifelike, richly detailed portraits. Copley paints a portrait of his younger half-brother, Henry Pelham, who will figure in prominently both in this lecture today and a later lecture. So hold on to that name. Henry is in this painting by John Copley. This painting is called Boy with a Flying Squirrel. And yes, that's a squirrel. I don't think it flies, but hey, that's the name of the photo. Painting. Why did I say photo? I don't know. This is a tremendously creative work of art. It shows Copley's ability to not only paint people, but his ability to show textural differences in clothing. Look at the sheen, the glossy sheen, and the partial reflections in the top of the wood. We studied this partly last year because of water. And if you've ever tried to paint water and how it looks, it's very, very difficult. They've got, there's craculature because this painting is really old, but just imagine without all the cracks and everything, how this would look, the detail in the gold chain, the details of the squirrel. It's an amazingly detailed work. And it's just incredible. He sends this work of art to the annual exhibition of the Society of Artists of Great Britain. So he sends it overseas. The realism of painting highlighted Copley's ability to paint in a range of textures and surfaces and attracted the attention of Benjamin West, who will again be featured later on down the road in this year's curriculum, another one of our artists. Benjamin West, American-born artist who moved to London. Benjamin West was also self-taught, like Copley, until he went abroad and learned more. West was the founding member of the Royal Academy in London, and he eventually convinced Copley to go east to London, but it took 9 years. That's why I have Copley goes to London eventually, 1774. A lot of history has to happen before he goes. He painted this picture of his younger half-brother Henry and the squirrel in 1765. All right, sends it over to England, catches the eye of all these famous people, and they say, hey, you need to come out here because you're not going to get educated over in the colonies. Copley marries one Susanna Farnham Clark, daughter of a wealthy merchant, and we're going to hear more about him later on. Marries her in 1769. They have 6 children, which is not very many compared to how many most of the people of the time have. He has success as a portraitist, and his wife's money between the two leads to a very nice life and interesting neighbors. He's so successful that he's able to buy property and build a house just across the hill from John Hancock. And we mean a hill has a name. You know it's an important hill when the hill has a name, called Beacon Hill. John Hancock, whose name is now a meme, you can click on these things later. John Hancock, by the way, the most successful and wealthy person in Boston, and he got a success mostly from evading taxes by being a great smuggler. Again, more of this later. Copley maintained friendships with both revolutionaries and loyalist factions. Loyalist in bold means it's one of your vocabulary term words. Copley painted a picture of Paul Revere, which we're going to get to in a little bit. Paul Revere, member of the Sons of Liberty, means he's a revolutionary. His father-in-law was Richard Clark. This is Susanna Farnham Clark's father, Richard. Richard Clark was a loyalist. He was the one who owned the ship that had the 342 crates of tea. It was his ship, his tea, that got tossed into the Boston harbor during the infamous Boston Tea Party, which was instigated by Paul Revere and the Sons of Liberty. So you understand Copley's position. One of his best friends is Paul Revere, and his father-in-law is Richard Clark. And this is like inviting Biden and Trump to the same dinner tea party. There you go. So got lots of stuff here, folks. Lots of rabbit holes to go down, but I'm going to try to go through this and get back to some of it, so I won't take all night. So the painting, which we'll see a more up close and personal view, Paul Revere. This is Paul right here, Paul Revere. I asked my son the other night, you remember who Paul Revere was, right? He goes, he was a lumberjack, right? I go, no, that was Paul Bunyan. Anyway, Paul Revere, patriot printer, silversmith. Born in Boston, third of 12 children. Born in 1734, his father had the name of Apollos Revoir. He was a French Huguenot. He anglicized his name to Revere in 1729. So this could have been Paul Revoir, not Paul Revere. Anyway, his father, silversmith, died in 1754 when Paul was 20, and Paul took over the business. So similar to Copley, takes over the business, but it's his father instead of his stepfather, and he's 20 instead of 13. Okay, so Paul engraved silverware and monograms, with monograms and family crest. Here's a monogrammed silver serving tray, and in the middle you can see the letters. I think it's MJL or MJT or something like that. So monogram etching in letters is like, yes, this is my piece of silverware. He engraved metal plates later on for printing and operated a small printing press, hinting, foreshadowing Boston Massacre of 1770. Later lecture. Paul's mother was one Deborah Hitchborn, and she was Boston born and bred, came from a wealthy Boston family who owned a shipping wharf. And so we got the shipping wharf, and then we have the father-in-law by Copley with Clark. Oh, so many tie-ins here. Anyway, taxes, tariffs, and quotas hurt the business. We'll get into taxes and tariffs in both the history and the economics, but it rears its ugly head in the art as well. Paul, being a silversmith, there was a quota on how much silver could be imported. So later on, we'll talk about the stamp tax and the Townsend Acts and things like that. But those were taxes and tariffs. This is a quota. They could only import so much silver. So if you're a silversmith and you can't get enough silver to keep your business going, you have to take what silver you can find, melt it down to make new silver. It's not as good because melting it down and recasting it's never as good. And so he doesn't like the fact that his business is hampered by these silver quotas. Then the Stamp Act of 1765, which we'll be getting more into later in both the art and history. And so he's really against taxes, against the English government, And of course, coming up with phrases like no taxation without representation, part of that was Paul's propaganda movement. He joins and belongs to the Sons of Liberty, who are major contributors to the Boston Tea Party. Out of the 116 members of the group that dumped the 342 crates of tea into the Boston harbor, most of them were Sons of Liberty. He also later on served as a courier, delivering news of political unrest in Boston to both New York and Philadelphia and all around. Paul Revere is a silversmith. It gets a little bit into his, here, these are all at the museum. This is a photo of Paul Revere's silver works. He sold practical items, and it mentions specifically flatware, shoe buckles, buttons, tankards, and coffee pots, etc. USAD loves to say all of the following were silver works created by Paul Revere's silver shop, except, and they do something like that. After the Revolutionary War, jumping ahead a little bit, the period saw an increased demand for more expensive products. Flatware, shoe buckles, buttons, tankards, coffee pots would be tend to think as inexpensive, even though they're made out of silver. And we can get into sterling silver, which is 92.5% silver. You don't want 100% silver because that's too soft. Anyway, later on, after post-Revolutionary War, intricately designed silver goods, elaborately decorated teapots and sugar bowls, large tea services, because you got to have something for the milk, you got to have something. British always drink milk in their tea or cream or something like that. Here's your little tea cozy. Anyway, Revere's teapots, I think VA should not be there. Teapots form a material culture that embodies, there's something, I misspelled something there. His teapots help form something, material culture embodies the interconnected economy of the 18th century, just like the pendant portrait showed, stuff from China, stuff from India, stuff from Mexico. This was very interesting because the silver was from Mexico. It was fashioned into the pots in Boston to brew tea from Asia, sweetened with sugar processed from sugarcane harvested in the Caribbean by enslaved Africans. Wow, there's a mouthful of history. So the interconnected web, and you imagine any kind of war slows up distribution methods, and not that we've got anything like, by the way, guys, so many connections between 250 years ago and what's happening today in the world. Can't even get me started right now. I won't stop. Posthumous fame. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow writes a poem titled Paul Revere's Ride. It's published in January 1861 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, over 40 years after Paul Revere's death. Nobody really remembered Paul Revere as anybody other than a silversmith up until this time. 1861, I remember as a kid in 4th grade reading Paul Revere's Ride, the poem by Longfellow. Refers to an incident on April 18th, 1775, where Revere was sent to warn John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and others that British soldiers were on their way to Lexington. By the way, he never would have said the British are coming. The British are coming. He might have said the regulars are coming, but that's a whole nother story for another time. The poem takes several liberties with the truth. There were 2 other men that were also sent that are not mentioned in the poem. One of them, the art packet specifically mentions Samuel Prescott. He actually is the one who completed the mission and alerted the residents of Concord because Revere was briefly detained by British forces. And another one that the art packet fails to mention that was also included was one William Dawes. It was actually William Dawes and Paul Revere that start out the ride together. And then partway through, Samuel Prescott joins them, and he actually is the one who finishes it. So all this stuff becomes really, really amazing. And before I even get to the painting by Copley of Paul Revere, I want you to notice that Copley painted John Hancock, who Paul Revere was writing to warn. And Copley also painted Paul Revere. Remember, portraiture, colonial portraiture, that's the whole name of this section. And why the Paul Revere portrait is so remarkably different than other portraits, it becomes a great comparison between these two. John Hancock, who again, an extremely wealthy smuggler, whose name is the biggest name on the Declaration of Independence, he financed much of the American Revolution. He was avoiding taxes to the tune of approximately, well, he was avoiding taxes on like 1.5 million gallons of rum per year. I read something, it equates to about a little bit over $2 million a year. In 2007, somebody had wrote about this. Basically $2 million a year he's avoiding paying in taxes because of his smuggling operations. This is in almost today's money, 2007's money. So he definitely doesn't like the taxes, and he's trying to avoid them at all costs. And if he can help foment revolution, John Hancock's your guy. Anyway, in this painting, you can see he's wearing a dark blue coat, embellished and trimmed with gold braid buttons. White cuffs extend beyond his sleeves. Silken cravat, think tie, is tied around his neck. His breeches have golden buckles. His silk stockings cover his lower legs. Modest, by formal terms, modest powdered wig sits upon his head. And this modest attire, modest for Hancock at least, this is Hancock being casual, understand. This demonstrates the uniqueness of Copley's painting Revere while wearing what amounts to working clothes, the difference between these two. The Paul Revere work, Paul Revere in his studio wearing work clothes, holding a silver teapot that he crafted himself. And if you look at, and later on I have a link to a version we can blow up, he's got dirt underneath his fingernails visibly dirty, fingers reflected on the surface of the teapot. This teapot is glowingly polished such that you can see the reflection of his fingers underneath his fingers. This is really detailed work. Again, Copley's a master at texture. The engraving tools, engraving is they scratch lines into metal plates and then force ink into the lines. And we're going to get into engraving later. I've got engraving videos. So his tools for engraving are right there on the desk. They're sitting on the desk, reflecting on the desk. The desk is a nice shiny surface. Desks would not look this nice, not a desk used for silversmithing. We'll get into that later. He acknowledges the viewer with a direct glance. See how John Hancock kind of gazing off absent-mindedly, whereas this is intently looking at you in a thoughtful pose, in a thinking pose. Acknowledges the viewer with a direct glance, wigless, unbuttoned vest. No gentleman would be out in public without a wig. So this is unique. Chin rests, I'll say wigless, unbuttoned vest, simple cotton or linen shirt, open at the neck, no cravat, no tie. His chin rests upon his hand, a gesture of thoughtful contemplation, showing he's capable of physical labor. He made the pot, there's his tools, and lofty thought. It's the only completed portrait Copley painted of an artisan wearing less than formal attire. Copley painted a lot of portraits, the only one where the guy isn't dressed up. One of Copley's strengths as a painter was his ability to convey a range of different textures and surfaces. Gleaming sheen of the silver teapot, reflected gloss of the wood tabletop, not indicative of what tabletop would really look like, a working tabletop. Wrinkled cotton of Revere's work shirt, Reflection of Revere's shirt and tools can be seen in the polished tabletop. Belies the naturalism of the scene, since more likely it is a rough, yeah, a real silversmith workbench looks like this. This is what a silversmith's workbench would look like. I have one in my garage. It doesn't look as cluttered as this. This is obviously a current one, but it would look like this. It would be really messy. So this is a totally, staged scene. The deliberate inclusion of the teapot is a subtle nod towards the antipathy against the Townshend Acts and Revere's political affinities. Britain enacted the Townshend Acts 1 year earlier to this, which taxed glass, paint, oil, lead, paper, and of course, tea. Tensions after the acts escalated, culminating in the Boston Tea Party of 1773. This painting of Revere is an anomaly in that it focuses on the nobility of work, representation of an emerging nation that aspired to be non-hierarchical, and speaks to the nobility of work, thoughtfulness, and egalitarianism rather than wealth and status. Remember, of course, equality very narrowly defined as old white landowning men. Early awareness that art could play a powerful role in creating heroic models for the new nation and for shaping democratic ideals. Even though, and by the way, the author of this packet contradicts her or himself. Page 51 says Copley's father-in-law, Richard Clark, his portrait of Paul Revere, who was a vocal member of the Sons of Liberty, was among his best known works. Not until after 1928. Later on, in the 2 pages later, the Revere portrait was unknown to the public until 1928. So on page 51, it says one of his best known works. Page 53, not known to the public until 1920. It was sitting in an attic. It was in a descendant's attic until 1928 when they lent it to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So not one of his more well-known works until about 100 years ago. Though it is now, I guess. So it's kind of interesting that they kind of missed that. Something else I was going to talk about. Let me look at the time. It's 5:56. So any extra comments, I
We
probably
did have
need
a
to bring it
question
later.
at
Oh,
one
good
point.
questions. Yes, gotta love questions.
Yes. It was, if you go back to the Longfellow poem,
Yes.
the question came up, was it written to boost patriotism during the Civil War?
I will have to review that. I've got a link to the entire poem here. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the fireside poets, wrote lyrical poems about history, mythology, and legend that were popular and widely translated, making it blah. It doesn't talk about, I have not read the impetus for him deciding to write about. I will review this and find out what I can find out, because that's a rabbit hole I love to go down.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, this is perfect. I think that if we quit here, we can open it up for anybody to ask any questions. And I'll leave the recording going if anybody has any general questions, and then I'll stop the recording. And if you have any, questions about your own time or anything like that, I think this today was a perfect example of both why we love the coaching academic and really a good taste of what you'll get for the next couple of weeks. Like I said, we will do the same interplay back and forth. As you saw me say in the chat, the Stamp Act comes up for Decker, comes up for SOSI as well. And again, this idea of, some real connections. People who were around last year definitely are like, oh my gosh, we talked about this last year, which is kind of wonderful. And also sometimes like, wow, there are other.
Wait until you do this 32 years.
I,
Lots of stuff comes back.
Absolutely. But I hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, throw them in a chat or just unmute and ask. Otherwise, you have a break from us until Monday. You can go get those packets anytime you'd like. If you have questions, you can always, I put my number and my email in the Google Classroom. You can text me or email me as you need to. If you want to go back and review, that's always a great thing to do. I covered the first few pages of the SOSI packet, and Decker, again, remember, started at section 2 of the art packet. But we will go on next week. Preview, we will basically try to finish section 1 of SOSI and finish a couple of the next artworks in section 1 of the art. So have a wonderful evening. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop the recording. This will be posted, and we will hope to see everybody on Monday of next week, for those of you who can make it. And if those of you who are listening, feel free to call or text or email or whatever if you have questions for anything that you saw along the way, and we'll go check those things out. All right.